Hey everyone, I'm Thanos Davelis, and welcome back to The Greek Current, a podcast by the Hellenic American Leadership Council and Kathimerini, where we highlight the top stories of the day every afternoon with analysis from guest experts, policymakers, journalists, and HELC staff. In the latest crackdown on Turkey's pro-Kurdish opposition party, the HDP, Turkish authorities on Wednesday stripped Ömer Faruk Gergerlioglu, a prominent HDP legislator and human rights advocate, of his parliamentary seat. Meanwhile, a prosecutor filed a case with Turkey's highest court seeking the HDP's disbandment. The HDP has come under intensified pressure recently, with the far-right nationalist allies of President Erdogan's party calling for it to be banned. The moves against Gergerlioglu and the HDP come weeks after Erdogan pledged a series of human rights reforms. Merve Tahiroglu, the Turkey program coordinator at the Project on Middle East Democracy, joins the Greek Current with a breaking analysis. Merve, welcome back on the Greek Current podcast.
Hi, Thanos.
Merve, at the end of last month, we spoke about Turkish President Erdogan's increasing crackdown against the HDP. Today, we saw that crackdown take a serious turn for the worse, with Turkish authorities stripping Ömer Faruk Gergerlioglu of his parliamentary seat and his immunity. For those that are not familiar with Gergerlioglu and the significance of his case, can you give us some background on his story?
Absolutely. I mean, what happened to him today is a blatant disregard on the part of the Turkish government when it comes to fundamental freedoms in Turkey and political freedoms as well. Gergerlioglu is a very prominent, primarily I would like to call him a human rights defender. He comes from a background in more Islamist politics and Islamic causes. He was a fierce defender of women's ability to wear the headscarf in university, for example. And then in the later stages of his political career, he joined this predominantly pro-Kurdish party, but it is basically a left-wing party. So he made that transition into that party. And then within that party, he became a fierce defender of human rights issues, in particular as they relate to ethnic and religious minorities. So he has for decades and throughout his political career been an ardent Democrat and a supporter of more freedoms for the citizens of Turkey. And so for the government to right now revoke his parliamentary status by calling him, the conviction he faces is for making propaganda on behalf of a terrorist organization. So effectively, he's forced to lose his status as a lawmaker by being called a terrorist propagandist for a social media post, for a tweet. And he's facing more than 2 years in jail because of this, and effectively he's lost his parliamentary status because of this. If this is not a major transgression to the principles of freedom of expression, I don't know what better example there can be. And of course, quite ironic that this comes on the heels of just days ago, President Erdogan made this big speech, this spectacle, which he called the Human Rights Action Plan, and talked about the importance of freedom of expression and freedom of thought in this big speech. And just today, what happened to this lawmaker, Ömer Faruk Gergerlioglu, just is the prime example that that speech was not serious at all. And people are still suffering, and a lawmaker can lose their status because of a social media post by being dubbed a terrorist propagandist. And not just a lawmaker who's so prominently known for being a pro-human rights activist.
Gergerlioglu has made it clear that he will not leave parliament and that the case against him is unjust, as you've laid out for us as well. He has filed a constitutional court challenge to the prosecution against him. What happens next?
Well, it's also quite bizarre that the Turkish parliament made this move today to actually strip Gergerlioglu of his status. It doesn't quite fit in the due process, if we were to think about it, because he did apply to the Constitutional Court, saying that this court conviction against them is political, and the Constitutional Court has not yet ruled on behalf of him. The Turkish government made a similar move against another member of parliament before, a few years ago, to a member of the main opposition party, the CHP. And it was a similar case where the ruling party in parliament decided to move and strip his MP status before the Constitutional Court had ruled on behalf of him. And later, the Constitutional Court, of course, said that this was a politically motivated conviction and overturned it, and the parliament had to go back and readmit him into parliament. This just happened a few months ago. And so there is a chance that a similar move can happen on behalf of Ömer Faruk Gergerlioğlu. And the fact that this possibility exists, and yet the ruling party decided to move today in parliament and basically call upon members to carry out this vote and strip his MP status now, just shows how politically motivated the whole thing is, because otherwise they would follow the Constitution and wait for the Constitutional Court's decision to arrive before moving on to strip him of his status.
At the same time as Gergerlioğlu was stripped of his seat, a Turkish prosecutor filed a case with Turkey's highest court seeking the HDP's disbandment. The court needs to approve the indictment before the case against the HDP can begin. But what exactly is the prosecutor calling for here?
It's quite alarming. So for many months now, in fact, perhaps a year, President Erdogan's ultranationalist far-right coalition partner, this party MHP, with which Erdogan rules basically the parliament, has been calling for a public prosecutor in Ankara to file a lawsuit against the HDP and for the shutdown of the party. But so far there were no moves. So today, on the same day that the parliament revokes the status of Gergerlioğlu, finally the Ankara prosecutor decides to take the MHP's advice and file this lawsuit. So basically, this is the first step in a legal process that could end up convicting the HDP or ruling that the HDP as a political party has ties to a terrorist organization, particularly the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, and through that they could actually ban the party for being against the Turkish constitution. That, I think, it is a process, so it might not happen. There is still, this is just the beginning, so the court might decide not to go through with the investigation. They might rule against it. This process could drag on for a few months, so it is possible that nothing is going to happen now in the next few weeks. But it is the start of this legal attack on the HDP. It comes amidst a growing number of case files against individual lawmakers and other politicians of the HDP. So it's all part of this broader assault that the HDP is already facing. And if Turkey were to ultimately carry through with this process and shut down the HDP, that would have such dire, not just in the short-term consequences, but long-term consequences. I mean, Turkey's modern history has suffered from party closures for decades. I mean, the state would intervene and shut down parties, and this has been a problem for Turkish democracy for a very long time. But in many ways, as President Erdogan himself comes from a tradition of Islamist political parties that had been shut down, it seemed that under his leadership that Turkey had gotten past the point where there is heavy repression. I mean, Erdogan is by no means ruling Turkey in a democratic way, but we thought that we had moved on from party closure. So if Erdogan takes this step and shuts down this party, it will just show that Turkey is losing all of the democratic gains of the 2000s, but that it could be actually going back into the 1990s, so really, really regressing. And I have to point out that from a democratic point of view, the HDP is no marginal party. It is Turkey's second biggest opposition party in parliament. It represents millions of voters, and for something like this to happen in a NATO country right now, I think should raise alarm bells everywhere in global democracies.
What reactions are you seeing within Turkey from among the Turkish public and from other parties in Turkey's parliament?
That's actually probably the most encouraging thing that has emerged today and really over the past few weeks. The opposition parties seem to be condemning, in particular, the stripping of the MP status of Gergerlioğlu, this lawmaker, but also uniting in their opposition against attempts to close the HDP. So there are some signals towards this. Some parties are coming in support of the HDP more openly than others. Others are doing it more implicitly. But I do think that the opposition seems to be uniting around this massive assault in a way that it has really failed to do for many years as the repression on this party has grown. In many ways, opposition parties turned a blind eye to this and facilitated this repression by not actively opposing it for many years. But now they really seem to be coming out against it. The reactions today regarding the case of Gergerlioğlu and also this lawsuit to shut down the HDP, I think have been very positive and is really showing us that Erdogan and his ruling bloc are really trying to use racism against Kurds and a fear around Kurdish national identity in Turkey for their own end, to increase polarization and to keep the opposition divided. But it seems to be not working. I think particularly the threat of shutting down the party is a transgression that other opposition parties, even ones that are quite nationalist and politically very much opposed to the HDP, even they are saying that this is a big transgression that we're not willing to accept. So I would say that that is the most encouraging thing I've seen watching the developments in Turkey today.
EU leaders are set to meet in Brussels to evaluate the bloc's relationship with Ankara at the end of the month, and they've been clear that they're expecting action when it comes to human rights and rule of law in Turkey. At the same time, you were quoted in a recent article in the Associated Press where you made it clear that for a real reset in U.S.-Turkish relations to happen, the Biden administration needs to see more of a democratization process. Is it safe to say that with today's decisions, the chance for any reset is, slipping further and further away for both U.S.-Turkey relations and Turkey's relations with the European Union?
Both the United States and the EU, the United States in particular since the inauguration of the Biden administration, but also the EU have been making it very clear to Erdogan that he really needs to show some improvement, real improvement when it comes to Turkey's democratic record and human rights situation, and that they see this as a priority in their relationship with Turkey and that he has to show some real improvements. And then he comes out with something like this. So if this case continues, I think it would be, and if this case actually gets anywhere and Erdogan endorses the shutdown of the party, which he really still hasn't openly done. He hasn't actually publicly committed to going after this party, although he has been demonizing it for a very long time. If he actually continues with this, even just the lawsuit itself today and the move in parliament today actually show that Erdogan really has no intention of delivering any tangible improvement on its human rights record at all. I think what this means to me is that the EU and the US should put even more pressure on Ankara and make it even more clear that this is just unacceptable behavior. One thing the EU has to absolutely do is so far they've been coming out with statements urging Turkey to follow its obligation to follow the verdicts of the European Court of Human Rights. And one of the most important verdicts of the European Court of Human Rights from the past year is calling on Turkey to immediately release Selahattin Demirtas, the former co-chair of the HDP, from jail. And Turkey has been actively defying this for over a year now, this decision. And so I think the EU needs to stop just calling on Turkey to follow this obligation, because it's very clear that Turkey has no intention of doing that, but to actually show some teeth and I think really talk about the option of seriously putting real sanctions on their Turkish counterparts until Turkey follows the European Court of Human Rights. Because if Turkey doesn't follow its obligations to international human rights, then how can we expect any improvement whatsoever to happen domestically in Turkey?
Merve, thanks for joining us with this breaking analysis. Always great to have you back on The Greek Current.
Thanks for having me, Thanos.
In other news, Greece on Wednesday raised 2.5 billion euros in a 30-year government bond sale that saw high demand and is aimed at improving the country's debt profile during the pandemic. The yield was just below 2% and the auction was more than 10 times oversubscribed, the country's public debt management agency said. Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis said that this was proof that Greece is back in an interview with CNN TV. Greece's finance minister said Wednesday's bond auction, the second held so far in 2021, signaled an end to the country's reliance on funds from successive international bailouts between 2010 and 2018. Greece currently has a cash buffer of 30 billion euros, but wants to boost its coffers as the economic fallout from the pandemic is larger than expected. Finally, the European Commission has unveiled a digital green certificate that could allow EU citizens who have been vaccinated, tested negative, or recovered from COVID-19 to travel more freely within the bloc this summer. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said the aim was to help member states reinstate the freedom of movement in a safe, responsible, and trusted manner. The Commission also said that there was still a lot to do to put the digital certificate in place, but the aim was to get it up and running before the summer tourist season. Prime Minister Mitsotakis welcomed the planned certificate, which he said would significantly facilitate the movement of citizens and will help boost tourism and the economies that rely heavily on it. That wraps up today's episode of The Greek Current. Thanks for tuning in.